what is grief, because I know there's also an idea of what grief is or what it means, but I found that your definition encompassed so much more. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you interpret or view grief.
Great. I think most people know that grief is the experience of a loss, and it's a natural experience that we all go through. It's both universal and it's also personal, right? So it's this natural experience that every single person goes through, but it's also a very personal journey. In grief recovery, is a slight difference in what a lot of people know about grief in terms of the stages of grief that people are aware of most commonly are the Kubler-Ross stages. So Kubler-Ross focuses on, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, right? So that sort of processing, and not necessarily in that order. So people are kind of comfortable with, oh, that all makes sense that I'm going through grief. People are also used to thinking about if I've had a divorce or a separation or a huge breakup or a loss in terms of someone has passed away, that is in my family or friends, then I'm grieving. Grief recovery looks at it in a slightly different way, which I have found the most profound way. And I'm glad that you've noticed that there's a difference too. It's interpreted as any experience that leaves a person in a split emotion. So if there's one experience that creates two conflicting emotions. So let's say a person has graduated from college or university and they're all excited about, I've graduated, but I have no idea if I'll get a job. So there's both the excitement and then there's a bit of fear. In grief that we're thinking of normally, we think about someone has passed away. And if they've gone through a chronic illness, people are used to thinking that, oh, I saw them suffering and they're out of that suffering. So I have a relief. But oh my God, they were so important to me. So I'm so sad. I'm so sad. And I'm so upset. How come no one was here for me when I was going through this? Is a lot of the questions. So there's a bit of anger in that. But there can be situations of joy that in this program are very much focused also on a grief or loss experience. So again, when we talked about that graduating, but marriage can be this way, right? So the woman gets married and it's so exciting that, oh, I'm starting a new life and this is wonderful. And then it's like, oh my goodness, I've got a whole new life to start. And now I have to adjust to someone else's style, or sometimes the in-laws, or sometimes sharing finances, or sharing a bed every single night, where maybe a person was really used to and enjoying their own bed and singleness, right? So there's two emotions going through that, even though theoretically most people would look at getting married as a very happy experience, right?
Hello, my friend. Welcome to the XO Conversations podcast. My name is Rishma Walji. I was a naturopathic doctor and PhD, and now I've turned scientific creative. I'm super interested in living my own XO life and helping you live yours too. You'll find all my resources on the website livingxo.com. Yeah, it's interesting because when I heard that from you the first time, I mean, being in healthcare for 20 years, like, you see people go through all sorts of different things. So many times where there were these conflicting emotions, and it's such a complex time for people going through different emotions, and then they judge themselves, I shouldn't be feeling this way, I should be feeling that way. And especially in the field that I was in with women's health and fertility and hormones, you see so much grief in so many aspects, whether it's in childbearing, whether it's in fertility, whether it's in their relationship. And I had never thought of it as a grief. I always thought of it as a conflicted emotion or something that they were going through again, but labeling it as grief opened up another way of looking at it, for me at least. And I thought that was really valuable. Have you seen that, when people realize that, oh, this is actually grief, not something else?
It is language. Semantics matter to people. And that language matters a lot to me too. But I like to put the positive spin on, even grief is an opportunity for a transformation that no other emotion can give. So I think if people recognize that, they recognize what kind of opportunity is coming to them in those experiences too.
Yeah, for sure. I think naming an emotion is so important too. And all of the work I've done around naming, or even like the neurological aspect around emotions, when you name an emotion, it's almost like when you're trying to explain something to someone and they don't get you, they don't understand what you're saying. And then you almost want to speak louder and speak louder until they hear you, right? And you can't figure out why they don't understand what you're saying. And I feel like our bodies do that, right? When we have an emotion that we maybe don't acknowledge or we don't label or we don't understand, it's like our bodies just speak louder and louder until something, more intense happens, until we finally realize what it is. And that was what the experience was for me with grief. It was like, oh, finally I have a word to explain all these things that I was experiencing. And of course, it's different when you're going through your own emotions versus talking to somebody else about their emotions. And so for me, for many years, I always thought, like, what is this emotion? Why do I feel this way? And when I finally labeled it as grief, which didn't seem like it would be labeled under that term, it actually opened up a whole new way of thinking for me, which was really liberating and very freeing, because I felt like I could finally understand what my body was trying, or my brain was trying to tell me. So that's why I love the definition and the idea that it could encompass so many different things, not just the loss of someone, but the loss of something or the feeling or something else, even any kind of conflicting emotion. I think that's really valuable for people to understand.
That I think a lot of times griefs don't happen independently too, right? So if we think of grief and loss, we think about someone who has lost a family member. So again, the most common sort of grief that people know of. In that time, there also might be a loss of faith that, God was supposed to help in this time, or that why didn't the universe help in this time? So there becomes two griefs that are happening in that time. But the person is thinking that, well, I'm already over this loss, but I'm not practicing my religion anymore. So that sort of idea, it happens, but people need to actually, I would love for people to open up to that awareness that so many things are happening simultaneously. And again, retraining what our thoughts around grief are too, because I think mindfulness, and I think you and I are both familiar with mindfulness, um, does actually talk a lot about labeling. So make sure you're labeling this. But if your thought process has a lot of beliefs of that's not a good word, that is requiring some attention too, right? Because there's no emotion that's not good. It's our human experience, but we
Mhm.
have labeled this is good and this is not good. So there's also a learning process in that too.
If you're enjoying this episode, check out the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Not all of them are video friendly. There's some really great audio experience podcasts and storytelling narrative style podcasts that you might enjoy. Check it out, XO Conversations. Can you maybe explain a little bit about people's misconceptions around grief? Because I do feel like there is an idea about grief, what grief is, and how we deal with grief. And I think you approach it in a different way, which I think is useful.
Yeah, I think they talk about the myths. So, grief myths that a lot of people are trained in or grow up with. That time heals is one of the most common myths that grief recovery talks about. So, some of these things of time heals, or they're in a better space. And I am very spiritual. So, I definitely do feel that because there is this transformative opportunity for grief, I do believe that there's a deeper message behind things that are happening. But in those sorts of trainings, people get let's take, for example, time heals. So give it time. You know what? This just happened yesterday. Give it a few weeks, right? So you just lost your job, in a few weeks, you'll look for new jobs and that sort of idea. Um, and what happens is a few weeks go by, and let's say a new job is not found. But let's say even a new job is found. Either could happen, but let's say that first job was the real one that a person wanted. That's so important that they wanted that job. That now anything else that comes, it's not going to be as good. And so when the person thinks back about, but I really wanted that job, they couldn't say that time healed that, right? So that was a grief, but time did not heal. Same thing will happen about family losses or relationship changes, where when it's really important, when it's really close to the heart, it's not so easy to say that, well, it's been 6 months, so I should be over this. But people will say this, and this is society's feedback. And so then a person starts feeling, I'm going to use the word guilty, though I don't love the word, but less confident about why do I feel this way? I should not be feeling this way, that sort of idea. And in that way, then the person starts second guessing their own feelings and emotions. So people are feeding back that, well, by now, so okay, 6 months, I'll even give you 6 months, I'll give you 6 years. 6 years you haven't got through this. And people will say, time heals and you really should get over this. And it's that response. And oftentimes the way people are speaking to us around us is how the mind is speaking to us within us too. So that's an important recognition that the most long talk that we hear is our own self-talk. And whatever we've been brought up with, or whatever we've heard from society, or whether we've seen it in movies or TV shows or family and friends, we say it in our minds. And unless we can catch that, do I really believe this? If I'm saying time heals, then I'm also putting myself on a time limit that this much time should be enough. There is, for each individual, there is an enough, but each individual is different. So one
Mhm.
person can lose someone yesterday and be okay today, and another person might be 20 years and they're still not okay. But at 20 years, they might feel like, I get it now. There's a reason for this. There's something that made sense now. And that's their processing has been done. But I do think that people feel that, "Oh, it's because I waited 20 years. It's time has healed." And that's not the truth. The truth would be that they've actually processed appropriately.
Yeah, time heals. That's a very common one I find. And there's also, I think, very well meaning, very well intentioned family or friends that say things that you almost feel like they didn't understand what you were feeling, or there were, and I saw this a lot in healthcare when, let's say, for example, a woman had a miscarriage. Sometimes they wouldn't even talk about it with their family and friends. It was something that was private. But if they did, then they would have some well meaning friends who would say things like, oh, well, you can try again, or, oh, something that, um, the person didn't connect with, didn't resonate with. Of course, it doesn't make it feel better in that moment, which makes sense. And maybe the other person didn't know what to say. And so they say something like this that is common in society. But then it's often less easy for that person to talk about their grief. And they almost feel like they can't talk about it because people will say things that doesn't resonate with them or doesn't make them feel better. And so you end up having a society that doesn't really talk about grief enough, and then there maybe doesn't feel like there's a safe space to really open up about it.
Correct. I think so. What you would be referring to when you were speaking about this would be what in grief recovery they would call replace the loss, right?
Mm.
So you'll have another baby if you've lost a baby. You'll have another baby, and if we can be compassionate for the people who are saying the things that are not quite right, I think when people go through grief recovery training and processing, one of the things that I notice that is a common aha experience is, yeah, in the time of grief, I know it's been my experience, and certainly with majority of people that I've worked with, maybe all, um, it's been this, there's nothing that someone else could say that would be the right thing, right? So let's say they say you might have another baby. So that in that example that you gave, it doesn't, it's not being present in the moment, right? So, I do a lot of power of now stuff, right? So this is being present to this person is grieving in front of me. Our instinctive, compassionate response is, how can I make this better for the person? And often the role of a friend or family member is not to make it better, except to just be present. Like that
Mhm.
must not feel so good. That must be really an awful place to be, right? That looks like you're really hurting. Those sorts of comments are just, it's not about solving. There's nothing that can solve a situation like that, except that feeling that someone is here with me. Someone is feeling with me. Someone understands how I'm feeling. And that's all, right? And of course, another person will never, ever, ever understand the same, even if it's the exact same. Two siblings can lose a sibling, and each one will feel differently about it. So no one will understand the experience the same. So then, of course, going outside of that, one of the things is, if we're compassionate, even as we're grieving, we can take in the experience of someone is trying to help from what they know. And I would probably do the same thing, right? That,
Mhm.
how can I make someone feel better? How can I help in this process? So that awareness, but it does, in grief, a lot of times other logical thoughts are not really so logical in that time, because it's a space where everything's a bit of a blur for a lot of people. So in that space, there's just hurt adding on to more hurt, which then adds in the vibrational perspective of, if a person is in a hurt space, there's other experiences they'll draw to themselves that add more hurt. So something someone says that was well meaning will be seen as, they're trying to hurt me by saying this.
Yeah,
So
or even if you're compassionate, I feel like in our society, we don't talk about these very difficult emotions or these, I guess, taboo topics. Like there's so many topics that are not discussed a lot. And so I think it's nice to have this opportunity to bring it up and say, there are ways of dealing with grief, or there are ways of processing emotions that may otherwise feel like you don't know how to do it, or there are opportunities. And so with that, can you talk maybe a little bit about how you help people process their emotions with grief, if they are looking to do that?
yeah, well, grief recoveries, which the process that I use most often for processing grief, you know that I've got the naturopathic background too. So I am also aware of, in terms of people might not know basics, that grief is linked to the lung channel in Chinese medicine. So grief is also affecting the immune system in Chinese medicine. Right now, we're going through a time that is affecting the immune system. There's lifestyle things to do. So even the position that someone is lying in. So that will be something that I will talk about with people, just as an initial sort of reminder for them that you might feel like lying down more because that's where your system is trying to draw you into. That would be just the basics of that. But grief recovery is the actual processing. So when I look at grief recovery, the whole process is about 7 visits that it takes. It takes 7 visits. It's a very well laid out plan that there's a certain amount of reading to do, there's a certain amount of writing to do, and there's a certain amount of sharing to do. And it is with the intention of pure and total honesty. So that is, it's repeated again and again in the book. And you would think, why would a person speak to a practitioner if the person's not going to be purely and totally honest? Sometimes it's because a person doesn't know themselves. They don't understand that, yeah, I guess I was not so kind in that time. And we all are processing and acting in our lives in the way that just feels right at the time. But so that's the process of starting to understand the self as we're looking at the grief experience. So in each session, there's a bit of homework for people to do, and then that sharing of homework in our sessions. I find that I am so happy that I actually get to see this transformative process in front of my eyes, where people are really, I'm hurting, to, wow, I understand that. So between number 1 to number 7, that's the processing that happens. And I will say 9 out of 10 people will get there. The 1 out of 10, I have seen that they're just not ready, which is okay. We've all been trained in a way that if you do these steps, you'll get to this goal. So, when we go through school, it's like you answer these questions properly, or you finish this exam and you're done the course, that sort of idea. This is about working on ourselves. And some people are just not ready at the time that they reach out, because they feel like I should do this rather than I am choosing to do this, which is a difference.
Yeah, that's probably the case with many different things too, especially in the healthcare world where, there's so many different things that can make a difference and cause a transformation, which is, I think, the biggest reward of being in healthcare as a healthcare provider. But if the person is not ready, or is not present, or feels like they're doing it for a different reason, someone else has told me to do this or something like that, then it's much more intense to do the work on yourself. You really need to focus on that and be present with your feelings, which many people find not easy to do. So it's nice to have someone to guide through, someone to be there and listen when you're having maybe some obstacles or challenges that you're working through, and having the support to really get through to that next stage. So I think it's amazing that you have these very structured steps so that people know what to do next, but then having that physical support of having you there to work them through it, I think is valuable, because we have so many thoughts that in our minds, right, that we think are true, but they may not be.
Correct, correct. It's really nice when people are ready to expand their thinking. And again, if you look at grief therapy historically, and I've certainly gone through it for grief experiences in my life, there is a difference when people think about grief and they think about bereavement or that sort of idea. There is kind of talk it out sort of perspective. And so a lot of times when people come to grief recovery, they've done other grief therapies. And the first thought they're thinking is, I've already done this. And it's not the same, because there's a very different participation in this, and there is a limit, as opposed to if we look at counseling in general. Counseling is kind of as you need, where you're at right now is where I'm going to guide you. And even naturopathic medicine, we can say that we're, very present oriented when we're in that space, that okay, a person is working through heart disease, but today they've got a cold, so today we're going to focus on the cold. And in this, it's about, we're focusing on grief, and there's the next steps to take now. So it's constantly just walking with a person and moving them along, and knowing that there is, it's a goal that you can see. I've got 7 visits to get through, as opposed to, wow, is this going to end? Right? This is like, I keep on talking about the same things, and this is what often people will do with grief. That I was talked about it with my first practitioner, and I've talked about it with you, and I'm talking about that sort of idea. But it's a very different processing in this one, which is what I also like. I like that there's a time limit to it. It's not just, and we'll keep on growing from whatever we learn from grief recovery. We will be able to apply it to all aspects of our lives, even if we're working through one experience, if we choose to remember that, oh yeah, I can look at it this way. And most people do, thankfully. So then it's
Yeah.
continued growth.
And not just the time limit, although I think that's a very valuable point, because some people can go through talk therapy for many years and they feel like they've already done it. But the time limit, I think, is also valuable in that there's a strategy, like there's a tool. You're learning how to deal with your emotions, not just talking about your emotions. You're learning how to deal with them, how to process them, how to understand them, how to move through them. And that's what I think is makes such a big difference, and why you're able to have that time limit.
Yeah. You know what I love about grief recovery is right from the first visit. Not what I love everything about grief recovery, I have to say. But I will say that I love that right from the first visit, people are learning tools that they can apply right away. So it's changing the thinking patterns right from the beginning, as opposed to the first visit is just tell me everything that's going on, right? Which is often how we assess in healthcare. But I really like this style. But I think maybe many health practitioners, but I'll say many type A personalities, and I suspect both you and I have fallen into that at times, or maybe many times, but want to see that, what am I getting out of this? Right. So that sort of idea, like we're kind of looking at, I want this to feel valuable, that I'm doing this and I'm learning something from, I'm using something from it. And I definitely like that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm a fan. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this. I think it can help so many people. And if anyone wants to contact you, do you want to share maybe your contact information or website so that people can contact you?
You bet. I guess the easiest place to reach me is through my website, which has all of my contact information, which is hearthealthbrainhealth.com. All one word, all small letters, hearthealthbrainhealth.com.
That's great. Maybe we can post a link below as well. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're so welcome. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this important conversation.